Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
When I was in my sophomore year of college, I lived in a house with 7 other girls. It was a huge old house, built in 1918, and it had the kind of look people usually find charming during the day. From the outside, it was big and old-fashioned, with enough rooms for all of us. High ceilings, long hallways, and more space than most college houses had. When we first moved in, it seemed almost perfect. There were 8 of us living there, which meant the house was always loud. Someone was always cooking, studying, showering, playing music, arguing on the phone, having friends over, or rushing out late for class. It was the kind of place where you almost never had complete silence. At least not during the day. At night, it changed. The house had a way of becoming quiet enough that every sound stood out. The pipes would make strange knocks. The old floors would creak. The wind would move against the windows. Doors would settle in their frames. At first, none of that bothered us. It was an old house. Old houses make old house noises. Most of us were not superstitious people. I was a science major, and a lot of the other girls were too. We were the type of people who tried to find a normal explanation before jumping to ghosts. If a light flickered, we assumed bad wiring. If the house made a noise, we blamed the pipes, the heating system, or the wood expanding and contracting. If a door shifted, we assumed the frame was uneven. We did not move into the house looking for something haunted. But after a while, there were too many things happening to brush off easily. The first strange thing was the doorknobs. They would rattle. Not all the time, and not always in the same room. But sometimes you would be sitting in your bedroom or studying in the living room, and a doorknob somewhere in the house would begin to shake. It was not the sound of someone casually turning it. It was more like someone was standing on the other side of the door, trying to open it. The metal would click and move, then stop. Sometimes it would happen once. Other times it would happen several times in a row. At first, we blamed each other. With 8 girls living together, someone was always coming and going. Maybe somebody thought the room was empty. Maybe someone tried the wrong door. Maybe someone was playing a prank. But there would be times when everyone was in the same room. We would be sitting together in the living room, talking, watching a movie, or eating food, and suddenly a doorknob upstairs would start rattling. Everyone would go quiet. Then someone would yell, "Who's up there?" No one would answer. Eventually, somebody would go look. There would be nothing. The door would be closed. The hallway would be empty. The room on the other side would be empty too. At first, we laughed about it. You have to understand that living with 7 other college girls means people will make jokes about everything. Someone would say it was the ghost asking to borrow shampoo. Someone would say it was probably a rat. Someone else would accuse another roommate of trying to scare everyone. But after enough times, nobody really laughed anymore. Then the doors started slamming. Again, there were possible explanations. The house was old. The windows were not sealed perfectly. A draft could make a door move. Somebody could have left a window open somewhere. A door could swing shut because the floor was uneven. But these were not gentle doors drifting closed. Sometimes a door would slam so hard that everyone in the house heard it. You would be downstairs and hear a loud bang come from the second floor. Then someone would shout from another room asking what happened. People would come out into the hallway. We would look around, check the doors, and find nothing obvious. There were also lights that turned on by themselves. That was one of the things we tried hardest to explain. Maybe someone forgot they had turned on a light. Maybe a switch had been bumped. Maybe the wiring was old and faulty. Maybe the light had flickered and we remembered it incorrectly. But there were times when someone would leave a room completely dark, close the door, and come back later to find the light on. Sometimes it would happen in the middle of the night. You would wake up and see light coming from under a bedroom door, even though you knew the room was empty. That happened often enough that eventually we started leaving some lights on intentionally, just so it would be harder to notice when something changed. The whole house began to feel wrong. Not every room, not every moment. But there was a constant feeling that you were never completely alone, even when you knew everyone else was asleep. I remember walking down the hallway at night and feeling like someone was standing behind me. I would turn around, expecting to see one of the girls coming out of a room, but there would be nobody there. Other girls said the same thing. Nobody wanted to admit how scared they were at first, because we all knew how ridiculous it sounded. We were college students. We were science majors. We were supposed to be practical and logical. But eventually, we stopped pretending. The house scared us. It got bad enough that another girl and I moved our beds into the same room. That sounds dramatic, but it was not something we did for fun. We were not having a sleepover. We were not trying to be silly. We had both become so uncomfortable sleeping alone in our separate rooms that we decided it was easier to share one room. At least then, if we heard something, we would know we were not imagining it alone. At least then, if a doorknob rattled, another person would hear it too. At least then, if a light came on by itself or a door slammed somewhere in the house, there would be someone else awake beside you. The house had another strange problem too. Rats. I know that sounds like a normal old house problem. Old houses can have rats. Houses near campus can have rats. A big old property with a basement and bad gaps around the foundation can definitely have rats. But the way we found them was not normal. On multiple occasions, we came home and found a rat dead on the kitchen countertop. Not in a trap, not in a corner, not near food, not behind an appliance. On the countertop, just lying there. The first time, we thought it was disgusting but explainable. Maybe it had gotten into the house somehow. Maybe it ate poison somewhere else. Maybe it had climbed onto the counter looking for food, then died. But there was no blood, no injury, no trap, no obvious reason for it to be there. It looked like it had climbed up onto the counter specifically to die. That happened 3 separate times, 3 different rats, 3 separate occasions. Every time someone would come into the kitchen and freeze. Then there would be screaming, because none of us wanted to be the one to get close enough to deal with it. The rats were not torn apart by another animal. They did not look poisoned in any obvious way. They did not look like they had fallen from somewhere. They were simply there, dead, on the counter. The first time, we were disgusted. The second time, we were unsettled. The third time, people started refusing to go into the kitchen alone after dark. The basement was the worst part of the house. It was completely underground, dark, and nothing like the rest of the place. Upstairs, the house had old floors, finished rooms, windows, and ordinary college house mess. But the basement felt like it belonged to a different building entirely. It was not a normal finished basement. There were several separate spaces down there, almost like rooms, but they did not feel like proper rooms. The walls were basically exposed bedrock in places. The floor was dirt. There were old beams, dark corners, and areas where the ceiling seemed lower than it should have been. The basement always felt cold, not just temperature cold. It had that underground chill where the air feels damp and stale, even if there is no obvious smell. The darkness down there was thick. It did not matter if it was daytime outside. Once you went down the stairs, it still felt like nighttime. There was an old refrigerator down there. Calling it a refrigerator might have been generous. It looked like it was at least 50 years old, maybe older. It was the kind of thing that seemed like it belonged in an old black and white photograph. It was huge, heavy, and ugly, with a thick, rounded shape of something made long before modern appliances became sleek. Honestly, icebox was probably a better word for it. Nobody ever opened it. People tried. At least a few people tried to go down there, walk up to it, and pull the door open. But every single person who got close enough would stop. That is hard to explain. There was no lock on it that we knew of. There was no sign saying not to touch it. It was just an old refrigerator sitting in a dark basement. But the moment you went down there, you got a bad feeling. Not a simple fear of the dark. It felt like your body was telling you to leave. You would take a few steps down the stairs, and suddenly you would not want to continue. Your stomach would tighten. Your chest would feel strange. You would feel watched, even though there was no one there. People would make it halfway down, then turn around. Someone would say, "Nope," and come back upstairs. Nobody wanted to be the first person to actually open the old refrigerator. After a few months, it became a rule nobody said out loud. We did not go into the basement, not alone, not at night, not unless we absolutely had to, and nobody touched the icebox. One night, we had people over. It was not a huge party, but there were enough people in the house that the normal fear of the basement became a topic. Someone mentioned it. Someone else said they had never gone all the way down. Somebody joked that we should finally see what was back there. Then, someone suggested taking a picture. We had a digital camera with a flash. The plan was simple. We would stand near the top of the basement stairs, point the camera into the darkness, and take a picture. The flash would light up the basement for a second, and we could finally see what was down there without anyone having to go into the room. It sounded stupid, but it also sounded safer than walking down. So a group of us gathered at the stairs. There were around 7 people on the staircase itself, packed close together. More people stood upstairs in the hallway and nearby rooms, waiting to see the picture after it was taken. Everyone was pretending to be brave, but you could tell nobody wanted to be the person closest to the basement. The stairs went down into complete darkness. Even with the lights on upstairs, the bottom of the stairs looked black. You could see only a few steps before everything disappeared. Someone held the camera. Someone else joked that if anything moved, they were leaving everyone behind. A few people laughed. Then the flash went off. For a split second, the basement lit up. I do not remember every detail of what the flash showed. I remember bedrock walls. I remember dirt. I remember shadows. I remember the old refrigerator somewhere in the darkness. Then the sound happened. It came from the back of the basement. It was the most horrible metal clanking, screaming sound I had ever heard. It did not sound like a pipe settling. It did not sound like a loose furnace part. It sounded like something metal being dragged or struck violently somewhere deep in the basement. There was a sharp, clanking sound. Then something like a scream, not a clear human scream with words, but a horrible, high, grinding sound that made every person on those stairs panic at the same time. The entire group ran. Nobody tried to investigate. Nobody asked what it was. Nobody waited for the sound to happen again. Everyone on the stairs pushed upward as fast as they could. People in the hallway heard the screaming and started running, too. Within seconds, the entire house emptied into the front yard. I remember standing outside with everyone else, trying to catch my breath. People were yelling over each other. What was that? Did anyone see anything? Who touched something? Was that the fridge? Did somebody fall? Nobody had an answer. The people who had been closest to the stairs were pale. The ones who had been upstairs were scared because they had heard the sound clearly enough to know it came from below. Nobody wanted to go back in. Eventually, we had to. It was our house. Our belongings were inside. But nobody went near the basement again that night. I do not think anyone went near it for a long time after that. Even thinking about that sound still makes me uncomfortable. I have heard old pipes make awful noises. I have heard metal scrape, furnaces turn on, and appliances groan. But that sound did not feel like any of those things. It felt angry. It felt close enough to hear, but far enough away that nobody could tell exactly where it came from. And it happened at the exact moment we flashed a camera into the dark. Maybe that was a coincidence. Maybe the camera flash startled an animal. Maybe an old piece of metal shifted in the basement at the worst possible moment. Maybe the refrigerator motor did something strange, even though nobody knew whether it worked. But nobody in that house ever found out. The last thing that made the house even worse happened during the day. That was important because most of the scary moments happened at night. At night, you can question your eyes. You can blame sleep, darkness, shadows, alcohol, tiredness, or fear. But this happened outside, in full daylight. I was standing on the corner in front of the house with my roommate, Becky. We were drinking beer, probably just talking, and enjoying the weather. It was sunny out. The street looked normal. Cars passed. People walked by. There was nothing dark, creepy, or unusual about the moment. Then, an old woman approached us. She moved slowly and had a noticeable limp or hobble. She did not look threatening. She just looked old, like someone from the neighborhood who had seen the house before we moved in. She asked us if we lived there. We said yes. Then, she told us that her great-grandfather had owned the house before the fire. I remember feeling my stomach drop. Before the fire. Neither Becky nor I knew anything about a fire. The old woman said that her great-grandfather had owned the house, but after part of it burned down, he sold it. That was all I remember clearly. Maybe she said more. Maybe she explained which part had burned. Maybe she mentioned when it happened. But I remember the phrase before the fire because it hit me so hard. I just about lost it on the spot. The basement, the old refrigerator, the dead rats, the rattling doorknobs, the lights coming on, the doors slamming, the horrible sound from the back of the basement. All of it came rushing into my mind at once. I did not know whether the woman was telling the truth. Old houses have stories. People like telling stories about old houses. Maybe she had the wrong property. Maybe she misunderstood something from the past. Maybe she was simply making conversation and had no idea how afraid we already were of where we lived. But after everything we had experienced, hearing that there had been a fire felt like someone had added one more piece to a puzzle we were already afraid to look at. The house was spooky as hell. I do not know whether it was haunted. I cannot prove that it was. There were normal explanations for some things. Old houses have electrical problems. Doors can shift. Rats can die in strange places. Basements can make horrible sounds. People can become afraid and start interpreting every little thing as a sign. But this house was different. It did not just have one weird incident. It had a pattern. Different people experienced things. Different rooms felt wrong. The basement frightened everyone, even people who had never been there before. The rats kept appearing in the same impossible place. The doors and lights did things that no one could explain. And then there was the old woman. standing outside in the sun, calmly telling us that her great-grandfather had owned the house before the fire. I still think about that place sometimes. I think about the doorknobs moving when nobody was near them. I think about waking up to lights on in empty rooms. I think about the rats lying dead on the countertop. I think about the old icebox in the basement that nobody would open. And I think about standing on those stairs with a group of people, watching a camera flash into the darkness before something metal screamed from the back of the basement. I do not know what was in that house, but I know none of us wanted to stay there alone. And even now, years later, the thought of that basement makes me feel sick. About 14 years ago, I fell in love with a wonderful woman. She was far out of my league, at least in my own mind. She was kind, smart, beautiful, and had a way of making people feel seen. I never understood what she saw in me, but somehow she did. We were happy together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like life was moving towards something good. I had been divorced before, and she had been widowed. We both had children. We understood that being together was not only about us. We talked about marriage. We talked about blending our families. We talked about what the future might look like once we figured out the complicated, practical parts of joining two lives that had already been through so much. I will call her Elle. I do not want to share too much about her because some parts of this story still hurt badly, even after all these years. There are things that belonged only to her and me. Small memories, private jokes, difficult conversations, and moments that I do not think I could explain properly to anyone else. But she was the person I wanted to build a life with. Then she died, suddenly and unexpectedly. There was no long period where I could prepare myself. No slow goodbye. No time to understand what was happening or to make peace with it. One day, she was part of my life and part of every future I imagined. Then, she was gone. I do not think I understood how badly it broke me at first. When someone dies suddenly, there are so many things your mind refuses to accept. You keep expecting them to call. You expect to see a message from them. You think of something you want to tell them, then remember they are not there to hear it. You wake up in the morning and, for a few seconds, you forget. Then you remember. And every time you remember, it feels new. At first, I tried to keep functioning for my kids. I did the things I had to do. I went through routines. I handled responsibilities. I talked to people when I had no energy to talk. I probably looked more stable on the outside than I felt inside. But at night, everything got worse. I started having nightmares. At first, they only happened occasionally. I would dream about Elle, about losing her, about trying to reach her and failing. Sometimes the dreams were not even clearly about her, but I would wake up with the same feeling: panic, grief, and the sharp knowledge that she was gone. Then the nightmares started happening more often. A few bad nights became many bad nights. Eventually, I began to dread going to sleep. I would stay awake too late because I did not want to close my eyes. I knew that if I slept, I might dream. And if I dreamed, I might wake up in that same pain again, confused for a moment and then crushed by reality. I started drinking. At first, I told myself it was just to calm down at night. I thought it might help me sleep. I thought it might quiet my mind. I thought it would take the edge off the grief enough that I could make it through a night without waking up shaking. It did not help. It only made everything worse in the long run. But grief does not always make you rational. Depression does not make you rational. When you are exhausted, hurting, and trying to survive 1 hour at a time, You can start treating anything that numbs the pain as a solution. I was drinking heavily, for hours every day. I was not trying to become someone different. I was not trying to throw my life away. I just wanted the pain to stop for a little while. I wanted my head to be quiet. I wanted to sleep without nightmares. I wanted to stop remembering every detail of what I had lost. Instead, I became more isolated. The more I drank, the harder it became to think clearly. The more tired I got, the more hopeless everything felt. I was grieving, depressed, barely sleeping, and making poor choices to cope with all of it. I began to think in ways that frightened me later. I had a Christian worldview, and I believed in an afterlife. Because of that, I started wondering whether death would mean seeing Elle again. I did not make plans to harm myself, and I knew suicide would be wrong, especially because I was a father. I knew my children needed me. I knew it would be cruel and irresponsible to leave them with that kind of pain. But I had thoughts I am ashamed to admit. Not direct plans, more like dangerous fantasies. I would wonder whether dying for some good reason, dying while helping someone, or dying in the line of duty might somehow be more acceptable. I started imagining death as something that might solve my grief while allowing me to believe I had done something honorable. Looking back, I know that was not healthy thinking. It was not noble. It was not brave. It was grief and depression turning death into something it was not. I did not act on those thoughts. I knew I could not abandon my kids. I knew that no matter how badly I hurt, I had responsibilities and people who depended on me. But the fact that I was even thinking that way showed how deep the pain had gone. I was in a very dark place. Sometime after Elle died, I was alone in an internet chat room. I cannot remember exactly how long after her death it was. A few weeks, maybe months. Grief made time feel strange. Days could blur together, and then one memory would stand out with perfect clarity for no obvious reason. I used to visit chat rooms once in a while. Nobody in my family knew. None of my friends knew either. Even if they had known, they would have needed my screen name to identify me, and they would have had to find the exact chat room I used. It was not something I talked about openly. It was just a place I went sometimes when I felt alone and did not want to burden anyone who knew me in real life. That night, I started talking to a woman. At first, it was casual. Normal chat room conversation. Small talk. Nothing important. I do not remember what we talked about in the beginning. Maybe work, music, the weather, or whatever people discussed online back then when they had nothing specific in mind. But after a while, the conversation became deeper. She said something that made me pause. She told me she could tell that I was in a great deal of pain. At first, I assumed she was making a guess. Maybe I sounded depressed. Maybe I had said something without realizing it. Maybe she was one of those people who always tried to turn conversations toward emotional topics. There are people online who are good at pulling personal information out of strangers. And I knew that. So I asked her how she could know that. That was when she began talking about Elle. I was immediately suspicious. I had not mentioned Elle. I had not said I was grieving. I had not said I had lost someone. I had not said anything that should have given a stranger enough information to know there had been a woman in my life, much less who she was or what she meant to me. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of cruel trick. Maybe someone I knew had found me somehow. Maybe somebody had figured out my screen name. Maybe a friend or family member had decided to play a horrible joke. Maybe someone who knew Elle was messing with me. It seemed impossible, but it still seemed more likely than a random person online knowing private details about a relationship I had never discussed in that chat room. Then she started saying things that I could not explain. She knew details about Elle and me, not vague things, not general statements that could apply to anyone who had lost someone, not the usual kind of vague cold reading where someone says you missed someone important and waits for you to fill in the rest. She mentioned things that felt personal, things neither of us would have shared with anyone else, things that were not public, things that did not make sense for a stranger to know. I kept waiting for her to get something wrong. I wanted her to get something wrong. That would have been easier. If she had made one obvious mistake, I could have told myself she was guessing. If she had confused a date, a place, a detail about Elle, or something about me, I could have ended the conversation and dismissed it as manipulation. But she did not. At least, not that I could tell. The more I questioned her, the stranger it became. I asked where Elle was. I had never said Elle had died. I had not even implied it. I had been careful. But the woman responded as though she already knew. She told me she could see Elle surrounded by light. She told me I was lucky, even though I had lost her, because very few people ever meet their soulmate, and I had met mine. I did not know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to believe it because I missed Elle so badly. Part of me wanted to reject it because believing it would make the loss feel even sharper. Then she said something that made the conversation turn from strange to genuinely frightening. She told me not to kill myself through suicide or some hopeful adventure. Those were not her exact words in every detail, but that was the meaning. She warned me not to pursue death, not directly, not indirectly, not through some imagined heroic situation where I could convince myself it was different. I had never told her about those thoughts. I had never hinted at them. I had never said anything about suicide in the chat room. I had not told my friends or family those thoughts either. I had not even said them clearly to myself most of the time. They were ugly things I pushed down, then felt ashamed of when they came back, but she knew enough to address them. That was the moment I felt truly shaken. I spent what felt like an hour questioning her, maybe longer. I asked her things about Elle. I asked her things about myself. I asked about moments that nobody else should have known. I asked about memories that were so private I had never shared them with anyone, not even Elle in some cases. I asked questions that I thought would be impossible for a stranger to answer. And somehow, she kept answering. She did not get everything in perfect dramatic detail. She was not describing my life as though she had been standing beside me for years. But she would say things that connected to details I had forgotten until she mentioned them. At one point, she reminded me of the clothing I had worn during a certain memory involving Elle. I had not thought about that day in years. I had not consciously remembered what I was wearing. But when she mentioned it, the memory came back all at once. The place, the feeling, the conversation, and the clothes. It was like someone had opened a locked drawer in my mind. I remember sitting there, staring at the screen, unable to understand how any of it was possible. I kept asking questions because I wanted the trick to break. I wanted to find the flaw. I wanted to catch her guessing. But every answer seemed to land too close to something real. At one point, she said something like, "You still don't believe me, do you?" She did not sound angry. She sounded patient. That made it worse. I did not know what I believed. I did not know whether she was clairvoyant, a fraud, a person who had somehow found information about me, or someone using techniques I did not understand. I only knew that she had said things that felt impossible for a stranger to know. Eventually, I asked her what she called her ability. She said it was clairvoyance. She told me she was not very good at it compared with her grandmother. She said that sometimes her visions were unclear or out of focus. Sometimes she could be wrong when she could not see something properly. That was another thing I remember clearly. She did not present herself as perfect. She did not claim she could answer anything. She did not demand money from me. She did not ask for personal information. She did not try to get me into some group, sell me a reading, or pressure me to keep talking. She simply spoke to me. Yet when the conversation involved me, Elle, and the parts of my life I had hidden from everyone else, she did not seem uncertain. That was what stayed with me. We spoke a few times after that. Not constantly, not every day. But on a few different occasions, we ended up talking again. Sometimes I asked questions. Sometimes I only needed someone to listen. I do not know whether she eventually got tired of me, whether life took her in another direction, or whether we simply lost touch the way people often do online. But I remember one more conversation clearly. A friend of Elle's had asked me if I could be her coach or supporter when she gave birth. Her boyfriend had left her, and she was scared. I had agreed to be there in some capacity because she needed help and because I cared about Elle's friend. But later the boyfriend came back, so she told me she did not need me anymore. At some point, I mentioned this to the woman from the chat room. She told me, "That's too bad. Her labor will be difficult. He's not as strong as you, and he will walk out." I remember being uncomfortable when she said it. It felt cruel to even think about telling Elle's friend something like that. I would never have repeated it. What could I possibly say? A stranger online says your labor will be difficult and your boyfriend will leave? That would have been absurd and hurtful. So, I said nothing. Then, I forgot about it. 2 months later, I found out that Elle's friend had a very difficult labor, and the boyfriend had left. I remember hearing that and feeling the same cold shock I felt during the first conversation. It did not prove anything. I know that. People leave relationships. Difficult labors happen. A person could make a dark prediction and later seem correct by coincidence. There are always explanations. There are always ways to interpret events after they happen. But because of everything else she had said, it felt impossible to dismiss. Even now, I do not know what happened in those conversations. I do not know whether she truly had some ability I cannot explain. I do not know whether she had somehow accessed information about me. I do not know whether grief made me more willing to see meaning in things that might have had ordinary explanations. I do not know whether I remember parts of the conversations more sharply because I was desperate for comfort. Maybe she was an unusually perceptive person. Maybe she was skilled at reading people. Maybe she guessed more than I realized, and I remember the moments she got right more strongly than the moments that were less clear. Maybe there was an explanation I will never find. But what matters most to me is not whether she was truly clairvoyant. What matters is what she said when I was at my worst. She told me not to die. She told me not to pursue death through suicide or through some fantasy of a meaningful sacrifice. She told me that the pain I was in did not mean I should leave my children behind. At the time, I needed to hear that. I had been carrying grief in a way that was becoming dangerous. I was drinking too much. I was sleeping badly. I was isolated. I was thinking about death too often. Her words did not fix me overnight. They did not erase the loss. They did not bring Elle back. But they interrupted something in me. They made me step back and recognize how far down I had gone. I still miss Elle. I still think about the future we talked about. I still wonder what our lives would have looked like if she had lived. And I still do not know what to make of the woman from that old chat room. But I am here. I stayed. I did not let grief convince me that my children would be better off without me. And whether that woman was a fraud, a psychic, a stranger with impossible knowledge, or simply someone who reached me at exactly the right moment, I will always remember that she told me to keep living. That part was real. It was summertime, so I was staying up much later than I was supposed to. School was out, the days felt endless, and I had gotten into the habit of watching YouTube on my tablet after everyone else in the house had gone to bed. I remember lying on my bed on my side, facing the nightstand beside me. My tablet was in my hands, lighting up the room with that cold blue white glow screens have in the dark. I was probably watching something completely normal, maybe videos, music, gaming clips, or whatever an 11-year-old stays awake scrolling through when they know they should be asleep. The room was quiet, not silent. Exactly, houses are never completely silent at night. There were probably faint sounds from outside, maybe a car passing far away, maybe wind touching the windows, maybe the soft hum of something electrical somewhere in the house. But nothing felt strange. I was awake. I was not dozing off. I was not having a nightmare. I had been watching my tablet for a while, fully focused on it, and I remember knowing it was around 2:00 in the morning. Then my tablet shut off. Not like the screen dimmed because it was low on battery, not like it froze for a second and came back. It completely shut down. The screen went black in my hands. At first, I was annoyed more than anything. I pressed the power button, expecting it to restart. Nothing happened. I held the button down. Still nothing. I tried again, waited, pressed it several times, and got no response. The tablet would not turn back on. I remember staring at the black screen, confused. It had been working perfectly a second before. I do not remember getting a low battery warning. I do not remember it overheating. It just stopped. I decided I would get my phone from the other nightstand. The bed had two sides, and my phone was on the far side. I was lying facing one nightstand, so I had to turn my body around to reach toward the other one. That was when I saw her. The moment I turned toward the foot of the bed, there was a woman standing there. She was tall, unusually skinny. She had long black hair. But she did not look like the girl from The Ring, or like a character from a horror movie. That is important, because people always seem to picture the same thing when they hear tall woman with black hair. This was not some familiar movie image in my mind. She did not look like someone I had seen on television. She looked like a person, and she was standing at the foot of my bed. I froze. I did not scream. I did not jump up. I did not reach for my phone. My mind went completely blank. It was not even a thought like there is someone in my room. It was more like every thought I had simply stopped. I could see her, but my brain could not decide what to do with what I was seeing. The room suddenly felt unnatural. That is the best word I have for it. Everything looked like my room, but it did not feel like my room anymore. The dark corners seemed deeper. The air felt still. The silence seemed bigger than it had been a moment earlier. I remember staring at her and feeling like time had changed. It felt like I was looking at her for hours. Not in the way people say something felt long because they were bored or scared. I mean, it genuinely felt as though I had been trapped in that moment for an impossible amount of time. She stood there. I lay there. Nothing moved. I could not think. I could not understand what I was seeing. I do not remember seeing a clear expression on her face. I do not remember whether she looked angry, sad, or empty. I only remember the shape of her standing there, tall and thin, with black hair, and the darkness at the foot of my bed. I remember her being close enough that I could not pretend she was a shadow across the room. She was in my bedroom. Then she moved. She took one small step forward. The wood floor creaked beneath her feet. That sound made everything more real. A floorboard creak is such an ordinary sound, It is the sound of someone walking in a house. If I had only seen her, I might have tried to convince myself that I had imagined a shape in the dark. But I heard the floor react to her weight. A small creak. Then, another step. Another creak. She moved slowly toward me, one step at a time. Each time she stepped, she became less clear. At first, she looked solid enough that I could make out her shape. Then, after the first step, she seemed slightly faded. Not transparent exactly, but softer around the edges. Like the darkness behind her was starting to show through. She took another step. The floor creaked again, and she faded more. I remember watching this happen without being able to react. I was terrified, but I was also confused in a way that was almost worse. I kept expecting my body to move. I kept expecting myself to scream, hide under the blanket, run to my parents, or at least close my eyes. But I just stared. She kept coming closer. Step, creak, fainter, step, creak, fainter. Each movement seemed slow, even though I know it could not have lasted very long. My memory of those steps is stretched out. It felt as though she took forever to cross the room, but at the same time, part of me knows that only seconds could have passed. She did not rush. She did not speak. She did not raise her arms. She did not make any sound except for the floorboards beneath her feet. That was what made it so disturbing. She was not acting like something from a nightmare that jumps out at you. She was simply walking toward me, slowly and quietly, as if she had all the time in the world. The closer she got, the less visible she became. By the time she reached the side of my bed, she was almost gone. Then she disappeared completely. There was no flash, no smoke, no sudden movement, no sound of a door opening or closing. One moment, she had been standing close enough that I could see her fading with every step. The next moment, there was nothing there. No woman, no black hair, no shadowy shape, no footsteps, no more creaking floorboards. The room was silent, completely silent. It was not a comforting silence. It was almost painful, the kind of silence that makes your ears feel like they are straining for something. I remember lying there, staring into the darkness where she had been, waiting for another sound. I expected the floor to creak again. I expected her to be standing somewhere else in the room. I expected her to appear beside the bed or near the door, but nothing happened. Eventually, I looked at the time. Only about 2 minutes had passed. That made no sense to me. It felt like I had spent the entire night looking at her. It felt as though I had been trapped there for hours, watching her stand at the foot of the bed and slowly approach. But according to the clock, almost no time had passed at all. I remember checking the time more than once because I thought I had read it wrong. It was still around 2:00 in the morning. I had not lost several hours. The sun had not risen. Nobody in the house had woken up. Everything outside my room was still asleep. But inside that room, I felt like something had happened that did not fit into normal time. I did not sleep again that night. There was no chance of it. I stayed awake with my eyes open, listening to every small sound in the house. I kept looking at the foot of the bed. I watched the doorway. I watched the corners of the room. I kept expecting to see her come back. Every small noise made me tense. A pipe settling sounded like a footstep. A branch brushing against something outside sounded like movement near the window. A car passing in the distance made me look toward the shadows in the room. I wanted to get up and go find someone, but I was too afraid to leave the bed. I did not want to walk across the floor where she had walked. I did not want to open the door and find her standing in the hallway. So I stayed exactly where I was. I waited for morning. I waited until I heard birds outside. That was the first sound that made me feel even slightly better. The birds started chirping before the sun fully rose, and I remember feeling relief that the night was ending. Then, the sky outside slowly began to lighten. The room changed from black to gray. Shapes became normal again. The furniture looked like furniture. The foot of the bed looked empty. The floor looked like an ordinary wooden floor. Nothing was there. But I did not feel normal. I had spent the entire night awake, replaying those few minutes over and over. I kept trying to understand what I saw. I kept wondering whether I had been dreaming. I kept telling myself I must have been tired. But I did not think I had been asleep. I had been watching YouTube. I had been holding my tablet. I remembered it shutting off. I remembered trying to restart it. I remembered turning toward the other nightstand to get my phone. Then I saw her. That sequence felt too clear to be a dream. I know people might say it was sleep paralysis. I understand why they would suggest that. People can wake up, or half-wake in strange states, see figures, feel frozen, and experience time in unusual ways. I have read enough stories to know that experiences like that can happen. But I never felt like I had fallen asleep. I was already awake. My tablet had been on. I had been watching videos. I was moving normally before I turned around, and I had never had anything like that happen before or since. I also did not feel paralyzed in the way people usually describe. I felt frozen with fear, which is different. I could have moved if I had somehow managed to make myself move. I just could not think. My body did not know what to do. Maybe there is still a normal explanation. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Maybe the darkness turned ordinary objects into a human shape. Maybe the floorboards creaked because the house settled at the exact moment I saw something. Maybe my brain connected the sounds and shadows into one terrifying memory. Maybe I had drifted into a dream for only a few moments without realizing it. I cannot prove otherwise. But I remember the feeling too clearly. I remember the woman's shape. I remember how tall she looked. I remember how thin she was. I remember the black hair. I remember the steps. Most of all, I remember the sound of the wood creaking under her feet. That is the part that always returns to me. Because shadows do not make floorboards creak. Dreams can feel real, but that sound felt like it belonged to the room. It felt like something had weight. It felt like someone was actually moving toward me. I have tried not to think about it too much over the years. Sometimes I wonder whether she was just a strange image formed by fear and exhaustion. Sometimes I wonder whether there was a reason my tablet suddenly shut down. Sometimes I wonder whether I was supposed to see her, or whether I only noticed something that had always been in the room. But I do not really have an answer. All I know is that I was 11 years old, lying awake in bed around 2:00 in the morning. My tablet shut off. I turned around to reach for my phone, and I saw a tall, skinny woman standing at the foot of my bed. Then she walked toward me, fading away with every step, until she vanished completely. Only 2 minutes passed, but it felt like I had spent the whole night watching her. My parents would often leave my sister and me with relatives while they went off on touring motorcycle trips around the country. They both worked hard, and those trips were how they got away from everything for a little while. As kids, we did not really understand the work, planning, and stress behind it. We only knew that sometimes our parents would pack up, get on their motorcycles, and leave us with family for a few days. Usually, we did not mind. We had a large family, and being dropped off with an aunt, uncle, grandparents, or cousins was often an adventure. Every relative's house had a different feeling. Some homes were loud and crowded, others were quieter. Some relatives spoiled us with snacks and toys. Others expected us to behave and help around the house. One particular time, my mother's brother and his wife agreed to watch us. At the time, I was probably 8 or 9 years old. I did not fully understand everything that had happened in their lives, but I understood enough to know that they were going through something terrible. Earlier that year, my aunt had given birth to a stillborn baby boy. Before that, she had suffered several miscarriages. I was too young to understand the full weight of those losses, but I knew they had wanted children badly. I knew that every pregnancy had mattered to them. I knew this baby had mattered to them. My aunt and uncle had named him. She had held him for a few hours at the hospital before letting the doctors take him to examine what had happened. There were things I heard about later that I wish I had never known as a child. Details about how the umbilical cord may have harmed him before he was born, and injuries to his face that made the whole situation even more painful to imagine. I did not understand the medical details then, and I still do not like thinking about them now. What I understood was simpler. My aunt had carried a baby she loved. She had waited for him. She had dreamed about him. Then she had gone home without him. My uncle was always a cheerful person. He had a warm, easygoing way about him, even when life gave him every reason not to be cheerful. He laughed easily, cracked jokes, and always seemed to know how to make people feel welcome. Even during that time, he tried to stay positive. But my aunt was different. She was grieving openly, even if she tried to hide it. Looking back now, I understand that she was dealing with intense postpartum depression on top of unbearable loss. At the time, I only knew that she seemed sad in a way I had never seen an adult be sad before. She spent a lot of time in the kitchen. She baked. She cooked. She made food for everyone, even when nobody had asked her to. She would move quietly between the counters, the oven, and the table. Sometimes she seemed focused on what she was doing, almost peaceful for a few minutes. Other times, I would hear her crying softly when she thought nobody was listening. She tried to cover it up. She would clear her throat, wipe her face, turn away, and keep moving. But even at 8 or 9, I could tell that she was hurting. I felt terrible for her. I did not know what to say. I was a child, and adults did not always explain grief to children in a way they could understand. I knew I could not fix what had happened. I knew I could not make her baby come back. I could not make the sadness disappear. But I wanted to help somehow. So I decided I would be useful. I would be polite. I would not complain. I would help around the house. And I would eat whatever she cooked, even if I did not really like it. That may sound like a small thing, but it felt important to me then. She seemed to like feeding us. She seemed to enjoy watching my sister and me eat the things she made. It gave her something normal to do, something caring, something that probably reminded her of the family life she had wanted so badly. So I ate the food. I helped clean up. I tried to make her smile when I could. At some point during our visit, she decided to have a garage sale. I do not know if it was because she needed money, wanted to clear out space, or simply needed something to occupy herself. Maybe it was all of those things. But there were a lot of things in the garage and outside around the house that she wanted to sell. My sister and I helped. We placed pieces of masking tape on items and wrote prices on them. We tagged old clothes, household things, books, toys, and whatever else was being put out for sale. It felt like a normal task, something small enough for kids to help with, but important enough that we felt useful. Then there were the baby clothes. They had been meant for her son, tiny shirts, little outfits, small things that had probably been bought with excitement before everything went wrong. I remember helping put masking tape on some of them. Even then, I knew those clothes were different from the other things. They did not feel like old shirts or toys being sold because someone no longer wanted them. They felt personal. They felt sad. My aunt handled them carefully. I do not remember her saying much about them. She did not need to. The whole house seemed to know what they were. The day of the garage sale finally came. They lived in the country, in a very rural part of Middle America. There were open fields, long roads, and plenty of space between houses. It was not the kind of neighborhood where a garage sale brought a constant stream of strangers walking down sidewalks. People had to drive out there. And that day, not many people came. There were a few visitors early on, people looking at old tools, clothes, furniture, or whatever else had been set out. But it was a slow day, the kind of sale where you spend more time waiting than talking. As the afternoon went on, the sky began to change. The air got heavier. Clouds rolled in. It started to rain. At first, it was only a few drops. But then it became clear that we needed to bring the remaining things inside. The sale was almost over anyway, and there was no point leaving everything out in the rain, so we began carrying things from the driveway and yard back into the garage. Boxes, clothes, small household items, anything that could get wet. Everyone was busy moving things quickly, trying to beat the rain and get the last of the sale put away. Then a vehicle pulled up. I never actually saw it. I only remember hearing that someone had arrived or seeing people appear near the garage while we were bringing things inside. Because it was rural, I assumed they had come by car. The strange thing was that they were not wet. The rain had been falling, not heavily enough to flood the driveway, but hard enough that anyone walking a distance outside should have looked damp. Yet the people who came in looked untouched by it. There were 3 of them. The person I remember most clearly was an extremely old black woman. She was dressed beautifully. Not flashy exactly, but with the kind of careful elegance I associated with older people who had lived a long life and carried themselves with dignity. She wore rich-looking clothing, a shawl around her shoulders, and thick glasses. Her clothes did not seem suited for a casual, rural garage sale in the rain. They looked formal, almost too refined for the setting. 2 other people were with her. I cannot remember what they looked like. That has always bothered me, because I remember the old woman so clearly. But the 2 companions are almost blank in my mind. I know they were there. I know they walked with her. But their faces, clothes, and voices are gone from my memory. The old woman had a thick accent. As a child, I stared a little. Not because I was trying to be rude, but because she looked so different from anyone else I had seen that day. Everyone else who came to the garage sale had looked like local people in casual clothes, maybe jeans, jackets, work boots, or rain gear. She seemed to have arrived from somewhere else entirely. She moved slowly, but not weakly. There was a calmness about her, a steadiness. I remember watching her as she looked through the things for sale. Then she came to the baby clothes. She picked them up. She held them for a moment. Then she looked at me and smiled. It was one of the warmest smiles I have ever seen. I know how strange that sounds, especially because I was a child and only saw her for a short time. But I felt something from her immediately. It was not just friendliness. It was not the ordinary kindness of an older person smiling at a kid. It felt like comfort, like she knew me, like she had known me my whole life, even though I had never seen her before. I remember a feeling of peace coming from her. Not in a dramatic way, not like the world stopped or everything around us changed, but being near her made the grief in that place feel quieter. The house had felt sad for days. The kitchen had felt sad. The garage sale itself felt sad because of those baby clothes. But when she stood there holding them, I felt as if something warm had entered the space. She walked over to my aunt. The two companions followed behind her, though I still cannot picture them clearly. The old woman handed the baby clothes back to my aunt. Then, in her accented voice, she said, "May God bless you and your children." My aunt froze. The words hit her hard. She began to choke up immediately. I remember seeing her face change. She tried to explain that the clothes had belonged to a baby who had died. She tried to explain why she was selling them. Maybe she did not say the whole story. Maybe she only got out a few words before she could not speak anymore. But the grief came out of her all at once. The old woman did not look uncomfortable. She did not pull away. She did not offer some quick phrase and move on. Instead, she took my aunt gently by the arm. Then she patted her arm in that soft, careful way older people sometimes do. It was a small gesture, but it felt deeply personal. She told her it would be okay. I do not remember the exact words beyond that. I only remember the tenderness in her voice. It was not a promise that nothing bad would ever happen again. It was not a careless statement meant to hurry someone through their sadness. It was comfort. My aunt gathered the baby clothes against herself. Then she went inside the house. I followed her timidly. I do not know why. Maybe I was worried about her. Maybe I wanted to be close in case she needed anything. Maybe I was simply too young to know what else to do after watching her break down. Inside, my aunt was emotional, but something about her seemed different. The grief was still there. She had not forgotten her son. She had not suddenly become happy, but the air around her seemed lighter. I remember standing near her, feeling quiet. The house no longer felt as heavy as it had before. It was as if that woman's presence had left something behind. After a little while, we went back outside. The old woman was gone. Her two companions were gone, too. There was no sign of them. The driveway looked empty. The garage sale items were still there. The rain had stopped. And almost immediately, the sun began to come through the clouds. It was one of those quick summer rains where the sky changes fast. One moment, everything is gray and wet. The next, sunlight breaks through in golden patches, making the wet grass shine. I remember the sun coming out and feeling the same peace I had felt near the old woman. The rainwater glistened on things outside. The air smelled clean. The clouds opened enough for light to fall across the driveway and yard. I asked my aunt who that woman was. She said she had no idea. That answer made me uneasy, but not frightened. I had expected her to say the woman was a family friend, someone from church, an old neighbor, or somebody who knew about the baby. But she did not recognize her. She had never met her before. I was there later when my aunt told my uncle what had happened. I remember listening nearby as she described the woman, the baby clothes, the blessing, the way she touched her arm, and how peaceful she felt afterward. My uncle listened quietly. The thing that stayed with me was not only the story itself. It was my aunt. Before that day, she had seemed crushed under her grief. She had tried to hide it, but you could feel it in the house. It was in the way she stood in the kitchen. It was in the way she cried when she thought no one noticed. It was in the way she handled the baby clothes. After the old woman left, she did not suddenly become a different person. But she seemed to take one step upward. Like that day marked the beginning of her recovery. The rest of our stay with my aunt and uncle felt happier. The house felt lighter. My uncle seemed more relaxed. My aunt still had sadness in her, but she also laughed more. She smiled more. She sat with us and talked more. The kitchen no longer felt like a place where she was trying to keep from crying. Even my little sister noticed it. She could not have explained it in adult words, but she seemed to feel that something had changed, too. The entire visit became different after that day. As a child, I did not have the language for what I thought happened. I only knew that an old woman had appeared during a rainstorm, looked at the baby clothes, blessed my aunt and her children, comforted her in a way nobody else had been able to, then vanished before we came back outside. As I grew older, I thought about it more. Maybe she was simply a kind stranger. Maybe she had experienced loss herself and knew exactly what to say. Maybe she saw the baby clothes and understood immediately. Maybe the rain stopped naturally, as summer rain often does, and the sun came out at exactly the moment that made the memory feel sacred. Maybe there was nothing supernatural about it. That is possible. But the feeling has never left me. The peace I felt around her was unlike anything I had felt before. It was not excitement. It was not fear. It was not even ordinary happiness. It was the sense that someone kind had come into a place of deep pain. Someone ancient. Someone gentle. Someone who understood grief without needing my aunt to explain every detail. As crazy as it sounds, it felt like we had been visited by something. Something benevolent. Something holy. I am not saying I know what it was. I cannot prove it was an angel. I cannot prove it was God appearing in human form. I cannot prove the woman was anything other than a compassionate stranger who happened to arrive at exactly the right time. But if God can manifest in the form of an old black woman in rich clothes, thick glasses, and a shawl during a summer rain, then that was what it felt like. She brought comfort to my aunt when my aunt needed it most. Not long after that, my aunt became pregnant again. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy. A few years later, she had a healthy baby girl. They became part of our big family, adding more cousins to the already large group of us. Of course, those children did not replace the baby she lost. Nothing could replace him. But they gave my aunt and uncle the family they had hoped for. They gave them joy again. They gave my aunt a future that was not defined only by grief. I still think about that old woman sometimes. It has been nearly 30 years, and I can still remember her smile. I can still remember the feeling of warmth when she looked at me. I can still remember the way my aunt held those baby clothes after the woman gave them back. And I can still remember the sun coming out after the rain, lighting up the yard as though the world had decided, for one brief moment, to be gentle. Maybe it was only a stranger. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe grief made that day feel more meaningful than it would have otherwise. But I do not think so. I think something came to comfort my aunt. And even now, retelling it brings back the same mix of sadness, gratitude, and peace that I felt as a child, standing in that garage while the rain fell outside.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
I was in a rural part of the Czech Republic in early 2017 with a couple of friends from university. We had a tradition of taking a trip together once a year. Nothing fancy. We would rent a house somewhere affordable, stay for a week, bring food and drinks, play games, talk, sleep late, and mostly enjoy being away from university for a little while. That year, we rented a large house in a holiday home complex out in the countryside. The place was meant for tourists during the busy season. There were several similar houses spread around the area, all built for families or groups who wanted a quiet holiday outside the city. But we were there in the off-season, when almost nobody came to stay. That meant the other houses were empty. During the day, the complex did not feel especially creepy. It was peaceful more than anything. There were trees, open land, quiet roads, and the distant feeling of being far away from normal life. We could walk outside, look around, and see no one. The empty holiday houses sat around us with their curtains closed, driveways empty, and windows dark. It was quiet in a nice way at first. At night, though, it felt different. Once the lights were off in our house, the whole complex seemed abandoned. There were no cars driving around, no neighbors talking, no lights coming on in other windows, no sound of televisions from nearby homes, just wind, darkness, and the occasional noise of the old house settling around us. The house itself was large enough for all of us to spread out. There were 2 floors, and we all slept upstairs. On one side of the upper floor were 3 bedrooms close together. 5 of my friends slept in those rooms. Their doors were only a short distance apart, so they were basically in the same part of the house. My room was on the complete opposite side of the floor. There was a long space between my room and theirs, maybe around 15 meters. It was not a huge distance during the day, but at night it felt farther. The other rooms were grouped together, while mine was separated from everyone else. I had decided to sleep in that room because I did not mind being alone. At least, I did not mind at first. It was quieter than the other rooms. I had more privacy. I did not have to listen to people talking after they were supposed to be asleep, and I did not have to deal with anyone snoring, moving around, or staying up later than me. For the first 5 nights, everything was normal. We spent our days hanging out, cooking food, exploring the nearby area a little, drinking, playing games, and doing the kind of things university friends do when they rent a house together. At night, we would all eventually go upstairs, say goodnight, and disappear into our separate rooms. Nothing strange happened. No weird noises, no shadows, no signs that anyone else was around. By the 6th night, the house had started to feel familiar. We had settled into a routine. We knew which floorboards creaked, where the lights were, which doors stuck, and which rooms were colder than the others. That was probably why what happened felt even worse. It was late, around midnight. Everyone had gone upstairs and started getting ready for bed. We had all said goodnight to each other. I remember hearing doors close in the rooms on the other side of the floor. There was some quiet talking for a few minutes. Then the house began to settle into silence. I was the only one still awake. I was in my room, getting ready to sleep. I remember feeling tired, but not sleepy enough to lie down immediately. There was a small window on one side of the room, and I noticed it was still open. It was cold outside, and I wanted to close it before going to bed. The window was not large. It was the kind of side window you might barely notice during the day. It looked out toward the edge of the holiday home complex, where there were fences, empty buildings, dark paths, and whatever open countryside surrounded the place. I walked over to close it. At first, I was not thinking about anything unusual. I just reached toward the window and glanced outside. Then, I saw him. There was a man standing outside. He was tall. He looked middle-aged. He was not wearing a shirt. The only clothing I could see on him was what looked like blue overalls or a blue jumpsuit, but it was hanging down around his hips. The upper part was not over his shoulders. It was lowered, leaving his chest exposed. He looked like a farmer. At least, that was the first thought that came into my head. Not because he had any tools or because I knew anything about him, but because of the overalls, the rough look of him, and the fact that we were in the middle of the countryside. But there was nothing normal about the way he was standing there. He was looking directly at me, and he was smiling. Not a normal smile. Not the kind of smile someone gives when they notice another person looking out a window. It was too wide, too still, too deliberate. He was standing outside my room in the middle of the night, in a fenced-off holiday complex, where every other house was empty, staring up at me and smiling as though he had been waiting for me to look outside. For a second, I could not move. I just stared at him. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would there be a man outside? Why was he shirtless? Why was he dressed like that in the middle of the night? Why was he close enough to be looking directly through my window? Why was he smiling? There were no reasonable answers. The holiday complex was deserted. We had not seen anyone else staying nearby all week. The neighboring houses were empty. The entire area had felt abandoned once the sun went down. There should not have been anyone standing outside my window. But there he was. I remember feeling the fear hit all at once. It was not a slow feeling of unease. It was immediate. My stomach dropped. My body went cold. Everything in me reacted before I could even think clearly. I stepped back from the window. Then I ran. I did not stop to close it. I did not stop to look again. I ran across the upstairs floor to the rooms where my friends were sleeping. The distance between my room and theirs suddenly felt much longer than it had before. The hallway was dark, and I remember feeling exposed while I crossed it. I kept expecting to hear something behind me. I kept expecting the man to appear at the end of the hall, or for a door downstairs to open, or for someone to grab at me from the darkness. Nothing happened. I reached the other rooms and woke everyone up. At first, nobody understood why I was panicking. They had been asleep, or almost asleep, and I was suddenly standing there telling them there was a strange man outside my bedroom window. I tried to explain what I saw as clearly as I could. I told them he was tall. I told them he looked middle-aged. I told them he had no shirt on. I told them he was wearing blue overalls or some kind of jumpsuit lowered around his waist. I told them he was smiling at me. I told them he was standing right outside the side window of my room. Most of them shrugged it off. They thought I had seen something in the dark and panicked. Maybe a tree branch, maybe a shadow, maybe an animal, maybe someone from a nearby property who had wandered through the complex. They did not seem to understand why I was so scared. But I knew what I had seen. It was not a tree. It was not an animal. It was not a trick of the light. There had been a person outside my window, a person who was looking directly at me, a person who had been smiling. I kept insisting that we needed to check. Eventually, I convinced one of my friends to come outside with me. Looking back, that was probably a stupid idea. If there really had been someone outside, we had no idea whether he was harmless, drunk, dangerous, or hiding somewhere nearby. The smart thing would have been to lock the doors, stay inside, and call someone if we could. But we were young, tired, confused, and probably trying to prove to each other that nothing was wrong. So we went downstairs. The house felt completely different once we started looking for him. Every room seemed darker. Every window seemed like a possible place where he might be standing. The quiet had changed from peaceful to threatening. We found a flashlight, or used our phones, then went outside. The cold air hit us immediately. The entire complex was silent. There were no lights in the other houses, no sound of a car, no voices, no doors opening, no dogs barking, nothing. We walked around toward the side of the house where my room was. I remember feeling nervous with every step. I expected to see him standing near the wall, waiting in the darkness. I expected him to be close enough that we would suddenly find him looking at us. But he was gone. There was nobody under the window, nobody near the fence, Nobody walking along the path. Nobody standing behind one of the empty houses. We looked around as much as we could without going too far. Nothing. That was what bothered me most. Where would he have gone? The holiday complex was fenced off. The other houses were empty. There were no obvious places for someone to disappear quickly without us seeing them. The paths were open enough that a person should have been visible. There was no nearby car starting up. No sound of footsteps moving through the darkness. No gate opening. No distant voices. He had simply vanished. My friend did not see him. None of the others saw him. By the time we came back inside, everyone else had already decided it was nothing. They were tired, annoyed at being woken up, and probably did not want to spend the night thinking about a stranger outside in an empty holiday complex. They told me it was probably my imagination. Maybe I had been tired. Maybe I had seen something reflected in the window. Maybe the darkness made a shadow look like a person. Maybe the cold air and isolation had gotten to me. But I could not accept that. I had seen his face. I had seen his clothing. I had seen his smile. The strange thing was not only that he was there, it was the way he looked at me. It felt personal, like he had been standing there waiting for me to notice him. Like he knew I was alone in that room. Like he knew the others were far enough away that I would have to run across the whole floor to reach them. I barely slept that night. I did not want to go back to my room, but I did not know what else to do. There were already 5 people in the other bedrooms, and nobody seemed convinced that anything serious had happened. I lay awake for a long time, listening. I kept thinking I would hear someone outside. A branch snapping. Footsteps in the grass. A hand against the wall. A window opening. Anything. But the night stayed quiet. The silence made it worse. Every few minutes, I would look toward the little side window and wonder whether he was still there. I did not want to go close enough to check. I did not want to see that smile again. I kept the curtains closed. I kept the lights on longer than I normally would have. I waited for daylight. The next morning, everything looked normal. The holiday complex was still empty. The paths were still quiet. The fence was still there. There was no sign that anyone had been near the house. No footprints that I could see. No marks under the window. No dropped object. No open gate. Nothing, and because there was no proof, nobody believed me. Even now, when I tell people about it. They usually assume I saw someone who had wandered into the complex. Maybe a local farmer. Maybe a drunk person. Maybe someone living nearby who had taken a shortcut through the holiday homes. That would be the easiest explanation. But it still does not explain why he was standing directly outside my window. It does not explain why he was looking up at me. It does not explain why he was smiling the way he was. And it does not explain how he disappeared so quickly in a place where there seemed to be nowhere to go. I know I was tired. I know it was midnight. I know isolated places can make ordinary things feel frightening. But I was awake. I was standing right at the window. And I saw a man. Tall, shirtless, with blue overalls hanging around his hips, standing outside in an empty holiday complex in rural Czech Republic, smiling directly at me. Till this day, no one believes me. But I know he was there. About 13 years ago, on Halloween Day, I put my 3-year-old son down for a nap. I remember being especially determined that afternoon because I knew what was coming later. Halloween night with a toddler meant candy, costumes, excitement, people at the door, flashing decorations, and way too much energy. He had been looking forward to trick-or-treating, and I knew there was a good chance he would be too excited to sleep. Still, I wanted to try. If he got even a little rest beforehand, maybe the night would go more smoothly. Maybe he would not melt down halfway through trick-or-treating. Maybe we could make it through the evening without a tired, sugar-filled 3-year-old becoming completely impossible. So I got him settled in his room and put him down for a nap. Our house had a pretty open layout, especially upstairs. It was not some old, isolated Victorian house with long, dark hallways and hidden rooms. It was a normal suburban home. It had creaky spots in the floors, squeaky door hinges, and the usual small noises houses make as they settle. But nothing about it had ever felt especially scary. We had lived there long enough that we knew the sounds. That mattered. When you have a small child, you become very familiar with every noise in your house. You learn which floorboard creaks near the stairs. You learn which bedroom door makes a soft squeak when it opens. You learn which cabinet bangs if it is shut too hard. You learn what your child's footsteps sound like when they are running, walking, sneaking, or trying to get into something they are not supposed to touch. We knew the house well. The staircase began in the living room. It went up, made a left turn, and ended near the master bedroom. The other 3 bedrooms were on the opposite side of the upstairs floor. To get from the master bedroom area to those rooms, you had to cross a hallway that was open to the living room below. Because of the open floor plan, sound carried easily. If someone opened a door upstairs, you could usually hear it downstairs. If someone walked across the hallway, you could hear the floorboards. If our son came out of his room, we often knew before we saw him. That was especially true, because he was 3. He had a very particular way of moving around the house. His feet were light, but he was not quiet in the way he thought he was quiet. He would try to tiptoe, but the floor would still creak beneath him. He would pause at doorways, shuffle across the hall, and sometimes climb onto beds or furniture with the loud, awkward determination only a toddler can have. His bedroom was in the middle of the 3 secondary upstairs bedrooms. One room was beside his, used as a guest room. The 3rd room was farther along the same side of the house. Across the open hallway on the opposite side was the master bedroom area. There was no secret route between the rooms, no back staircase, no hallway that looped around. If someone walked from his bedroom to the guest room, then toward the master bedroom, there was only one path they could take. You could not pass someone on that upstairs floor without being seen or heard. The layout was simple and open. After putting him down for his nap, I went downstairs. I turned on the television, sat down in the living room, and decided to rest for a little while myself. I was tired, and since he was supposed to be napping, it was one of those rare, quiet moments parents learn to appreciate. At first, everything was normal. The television was playing softly. The house was quiet. I assumed he had gone to sleep. Then I heard his bedroom door open. It was a soft sound, but familiar. His door had a particular hinge that made a quiet creak when it moved. Not loud enough to alarm anyone, but distinct enough that I recognized it immediately. I looked up from the television and listened. A moment later, I heard the floorboard outside his room creak. Then I heard the light patter of little feet. I knew exactly what I thought had happened. He had gotten out of bed. That was not surprising at all. He was excited for Halloween. He had probably been lying in bed, thinking about his costume, candy, pumpkins, and going outside later that night. I had expected him to resist the nap. I was only surprised he had stayed in his room as long as he had. I listened as the footsteps moved from his bedroom toward the guest room next door. The guest room door opened. Then I heard the creak of the floorboard between the rooms. It sounded exactly like him. Small feet moving carefully. A pause. Then the soft sound of someone climbing onto the guest bed. The mattress springs shifted slightly. After that, everything became quiet. I sat downstairs and thought maybe he just decided to nap in there instead. It was not ideal, but it was not worth starting a battle over. If he had crawled into the guest bed and fallen asleep, then fine. At least he was resting. I did not care which bed he used as long as he slept. I did not feel like going upstairs just to move a sleepy child from one room to another, so I stayed where I was. A few minutes passed. The house remained quiet. Then, around 10 minutes later, I heard the movement again. The guest room bed creaked. It sounded like someone climbing down. Then I heard the small footsteps move back into the hallway. Again, I assumed it was my son. The footsteps crossed the open upstairs hall toward the master bedroom. The floorboards in that part of the house had their own familiar creaks, and I heard them one after another. Creak, pause, creak, pause. It sounded like a small child moving slowly, perhaps trying to be sneaky. I could not see the hallway from where I was sitting downstairs, but I did not need to. I could hear the root clearly enough. I knew exactly where the sounds were coming from. Then I heard the master bedroom door. It opened. I could hear movement inside the room. At first, it sounded like someone touching or shifting something. Maybe a drawer, maybe clothes, maybe the bedding. Nothing loud, but enough to make me think my son was exploring. That was when the cat came running down the stairs. Our cat had been sleeping on our bed upstairs. She was not fond of toddler behavior. She tolerated my son, but she did not enjoy being poked, climbed on, chased, or disturbed while she was trying to sleep. Whenever he got too close to her, she usually found a way to escape. So when she came flying down the stairs, I assumed he had found her. She rushed down quickly, with that irritated, determined movement cats have when they have had enough. She did not stroll downstairs casually. She bolted past me and disappeared into another part of the house. That convinced me. He was definitely upstairs. He had gotten out of bed, gone into the guest room, climbed on the bed, walked into the master bedroom, disturbed the cat, and probably started messing with something he should not have been touching. I decided it was time to go upstairs and catch him. I did not storm up the stairs. I actually tried to be quiet. I thought I would sneak up on him and catch him red-handed. I imagined opening the door and finding him standing on the bed, playing with something or trying to get into a drawer. I wanted to give him a gentle, amused aha, then send him back to bed. I climbed the stairs slowly. The house was quiet again. When I reached the top, I looked toward the master bedroom. The door was open. I stepped inside. Nobody was there. At first, I was not worried. I thought maybe he had walked into the bathroom. I checked the master bathroom. Empty. I looked behind the door. Nothing. I checked around the bed. Nothing. The bedding was disturbed enough that I could see why the cat had fled, but there was no toddler standing there, no toy on the floor, and no obvious sign of what he had been doing. I stood there for a second, confused. Then I thought maybe he had gone back down the hall. That was possible. Maybe he heard me coming upstairs and ran back toward his room. Maybe he was trying to hide. I walked back out into the hallway and looked toward the guest room. It was only a short distance away. The upstairs was open enough that I should have seen him if he had crossed from one side to the other. There was nowhere for him to go without passing through that hall. Still, I checked. I walked into the guest room. The bed covers were messed up. Not destroyed or thrown around, but disturbed in the way they would be if a small child had climbed onto the bed and moved around for a while. I looked under the bed. Nothing. I checked the closet. Nothing. I looked behind the door. Nothing. The room was empty. That was when I started to feel uneasy. It had only been about 30 seconds since the cat came running downstairs. Maybe less. There was no way my son could have left the master bedroom, crossed the hallway, gone into the guest room, left again, crossed back past me somehow, and disappeared without me seeing or hearing him. The upstairs was too open. I had come up the only staircase. There was nowhere else for him to go. I stood in the guest room trying to think. Maybe he had gone back to his own room. That was the only explanation that made sense. Maybe he had slipped past me before I reached the top of the stairs. Maybe I had been too focused on the master bedroom to notice him moving down the hall. Maybe he had quietly gone into his room before I entered the guest room. It seemed unlikely, but it was still more believable than anything else. I walked toward his bedroom. As I approached the door, I tried to prepare myself to find him playing. I imagined him sitting on the floor with toys from the other rooms, pretending he had never left his bed. I imagined giving him that surprised parent look and saying, "Aha, I knew you were awake." I opened the door quietly. Then I stopped. My son was asleep. He was lying in his bed exactly as I had left him. The blankets were around him. His toys were where I had placed them when I put him down for his nap. He was not pretending. He was not lying still to fool me. He was fully asleep. His breathing was slow and even. There was no sign that he had gotten out of bed at all. I just stood there in the doorway. For a moment, I could not understand what I was looking at. I knew I had heard his bedroom door open. I knew I had heard little feet walking across the creaky floorboard outside his room. I knew I had heard someone enter the guest room and climb onto the bed. I knew I had heard someone walk down the hall into the master bedroom. I knew the cat had come racing downstairs as if someone had disturbed her. But my son had been asleep the whole time. I looked around his room again. The door was not open in some strange way. The toys were not scattered. Nothing looked disturbed. He had not moved. He had not been in the guest room. He had not been in the master bedroom. He had been asleep in his own bed. I remember feeling my whole body go cold. The house had been empty except for me, my son, and the cat. No one else was home. There was no family member upstairs, no friend stopping by, no stranger who could have walked through the house unnoticed. The doors were locked. The house was quiet. Yet something had moved through the upstairs rooms with the exact rhythm and sound of a small child. I did not wake him. I did not want to disturb him, and I did not know what I would even say. Instead, I stood there for a while, watching him sleep. I needed to see that he was really there. I needed to reassure myself that I had not somehow imagined putting him down for a nap, or that I had not mistaken another sound for him walking around. But he was there. Sleeping, safe, I slowly backed out of the room and closed the door. For the rest of the afternoon, I was on edge. Every small noise made me look up. Every creak from upstairs made me wonder whether I would hear those little footsteps again. I kept glancing toward the staircase. I kept expecting the guest room door to open. I kept expecting the cat to come running downstairs a second time. Nothing else happened. Eventually, my son woke up from his nap. He came downstairs normally. He was cheerful and excited, as if nothing unusual had happened. He talked about Halloween and trick-or-treating. He did not mention getting out of bed. He did not mention going into the guest room or the master bedroom. I asked him casually whether he had gone into the other rooms. He said no. At 3 years old, he could have been lying, of course. Toddlers can be sneaky, especially when they know they are not supposed to leave their room. But he did not seem like he was hiding anything. He was confused by the question, and the more I thought about it, the less it seemed possible that he had done it. The sounds had been too clear. I had heard the entire path. His door opening. The hallway floorboard. The guest room door. The mattress shifting. The footsteps moving toward the master bedroom, the cat running down the stairs. If he had actually made that trip, I should have found him somewhere upstairs. There was no way around me. The house did not have a second staircase or some hidden hallway. The upstairs was linear. To get from one side to the other, you had to cross the same open hall I crossed when I went looking for him. I never found a normal explanation. Maybe the house was making several unrelated noises at the exact right times, and my mind assembled them into the story of my son getting out of bed. Maybe the guest room bedding had been moved earlier, and I did not notice. Maybe the cat had been disturbed by something else entirely. Maybe I heard a door shift and thought it was his bedroom door. Maybe old floorboards creaked because of the house settling. All of that is possible. The house was not ancient, but suburban homes still creak and pop. Doors still move. Cats still get startled. A tired parent can hear one sound and assume it belongs to a child. But what I cannot explain is how specific it felt. I knew those sounds. I had lived there long enough to know which floorboards creaked. I knew the soft sound of my son's feet. I knew the guest room bed. I knew the master bedroom door. And I knew why the cat would run downstairs so quickly. I had heard what sounded exactly like my toddler traveling from room to room upstairs. Then I found him asleep in his bed with the same toys and blankets I had left with him 15 minutes earlier. The timing made it even stranger. It was Halloween afternoon. The house was quiet. No one else was home. The whole thing happened during a short nap I had been hoping he would take before trick-or-treating. Nothing else ever happened in that house quite like it. There were no repeated footsteps, no figures in hallways, no doors slamming by themselves. It was not a place we thought of as haunted. It was simply a normal family home where, one afternoon, something seemed to imitate the movement of a 3-year-old child. I still think about it sometimes. Not because I believe I know exactly what it was. I do not. But because of the feeling I had when I opened my son's bedroom door. I had gone upstairs expecting to catch him awake. I expected a messy room, a guilty face, maybe a little laugh. Instead, I found him sleeping peacefully. And for the first time, I had to wonder who or what I had been following through the house. In our old house, there was this one corner of the living room that always creeped me out. There was nothing obviously wrong with it. It was not a dark closet, a broken doorway, or a place where something had happened that I knew of. It was just a corner of the room. During the day, it looked completely normal. Sunlight came through the windows, the furniture looked ordinary, and the corner blended in with everything else. But at night, I hated it. Even when I was young, I could not explain exactly why. I just had this strong feeling that I was being watched from that spot. It was not like I clearly saw someone standing there. I never saw a face, a shadow, or a figure looking back at me. It was more like the corner had a presence. Whenever I walked through the living room after dark, I would notice it. The feeling would start before I even looked directly at that part of the room. My stomach would tighten, and I would suddenly feel exposed. I would feel like I needed to move faster, like I should not stand still with my back turned toward it. The house itself was not especially scary. It was old, but not ancient. It made the usual house noises. The floors creaked sometimes, the pipes knocked every now and then, and the walls made little popping sounds when the temperature changed. At night, you could hear the refrigerator running from the kitchen and the wind moving around outside. Nothing about it felt haunted in the way people imagine haunted houses. There were no doors opening by themselves, no lights flickering, no voices, no strange smells, no obvious signs that something was wrong. It was just that corner. During the day, I could sit in the living room and barely think about it. I would watch TV, play games, talk with my parents, or sit on the couch while the room filled with sunlight. If I looked at the corner in the afternoon, it did not seem threatening at all. It was only at night that it changed. The living room was positioned in a way that made it darker than the rest of the house after sunset. The hallway lights did not reach that far. The television would cast a weak glow across the floor, and sometimes there would be light from the kitchen, but that corner always seemed to stay darker than it should have. I would walk through the room to get a drink, use the bathroom, or go to my bedroom, and I would feel myself avoiding it. I would turn on lights before crossing the room. I would move quickly. Sometimes I would practically run. It sounds silly now, but when you are young, a feeling can become stronger every time you listen to it. I did not know whether the corner was truly dangerous. I did not know whether something was actually there, but I knew I did not like having to pass it in the dark. I did not want to look at it too long. I did not want to get too close, and I definitely did not want to stand there with the lights off. My parents never really understood why I was so nervous about it. They would see me flick on every light in the room just to walk through it, or notice me rushing past the couch and toward the hallway. They would ask what I was doing, and I would not have a good answer. What was I supposed to say? That one corner of the living room made me feel watched, that it felt like someone was standing there even though I could see nothing, that I hated it more at night because it seemed like the darkness inside that corner was somehow different from the darkness everywhere else. I knew it sounded ridiculous, so I would usually shrug it off. I would say I was just tired or did not like the dark. Maybe I would make a joke about it. But even then, I could feel my eyes drifting back toward that spot, checking whether it looked different. It never did. It always looked empty. A couple of years after we moved into the house, we got a dog. She became part of the family quickly. She had her own routines, her own favorite places to sleep, and her own way of reacting to people. She was usually friendly and energetic. She was not the kind of dog who barked at every little sound or panicked for no reason. She would bark if someone came near the house. She would react to squirrels, birds, cats, and anything moving through the yard. But inside, she was normally calm. She liked being around people. She liked lying near us in the living room. She would sleep on the floor, curl up beside furniture, or follow someone from room to room. She never seemed bothered by the house at first. For a while, I thought maybe having her around would make me feel better too. There is something comforting about a dog sleeping nearby. They react to things you do not notice, but they also make a house feel less empty. If I had to walk through the living room at night and she was with me, I felt less nervous than I did alone. Then one night, she slept inside my room. I do not remember why she was in there that particular night. Maybe she had been restless. Maybe I had wanted her nearby. Maybe my parents had let her sleep inside because of bad weather or because she had been acting needy. Whatever the reason, she was on the floor in my room while I slept. At some point during the night, she woke me up because she needed to go outside. She was pacing around, making those little restless sounds dogs make when they need something. She was not barking. She was not panicking. She was simply trying to get my attention. I got up. The house was dark. I remember that groggy feeling of waking in the middle of the night when your brain is not fully awake and everything seems slightly unfamiliar. My room was dim. The hallway outside was dark. I probably did not want to get out of bed at all, but I knew she needed to go outside. So I opened my bedroom door and started walking with her toward the living room. The moment we reached the edge of it, she stopped, not slowed down. Stopped. Her whole body went stiff. At first, I thought she had heard something outside. Maybe an animal was in the yard. Maybe she had noticed the noise from the kitchen. I looked down at her, expecting her to head toward the back door. Instead, she was staring directly at that corner, the same corner that had always made me uneasy. She was looking at it so intensely that I felt my stomach drop before she even made a sound. Her ears were up. Her body was tense. Her eyes were fixed on the darkness. Then she started barking. I had heard her bark before, of course. I had heard her bark at delivery people, animals outside, strange noises, and people she did not know. But this was different. She was barking like I had never heard her bark before. It was loud, sharp, frantic barking. Not playful, not territorial in the normal way. It sounded scared. She took a step toward the corner, barked, then pulled herself back slightly. She whined between barks. Her fur stood up. She kept staring at the same exact place as if there was someone standing there, just out of sight. I froze. For a second, I could not make myself turn on the lights. That sounds stupid, but I was scared of what I might see. The corner had always felt wrong to me, but I had never had proof that anything was there. I had always been able to tell myself it was childhood nerves, a weird reaction to the dark, or my imagination turning an ordinary part of the room into something threatening. But now, the dog was reacting too. And she was not looking around the room. She was not barking toward the front door. She was not reacting to a sound outside. She was staring straight into that one corner. I reached for the switch and turned on the lights. The room lit up immediately. Everything looked normal. The couch was where it always was. The tables and chairs were in their places. The walls were empty. The corner was empty. There was nothing there. No person. No animal. No shadow moving across the wall. Nothing. But the dog did not calm down. She kept barking at it. She whined, paced, barked again, then backed away from that side of the room. She would not go closer. Even with the lights on, even with the room completely visible, she acted as if something was still standing there. My parents woke up because of the noise. I remember them coming out, confused and irritated at first because it was the middle of the night. They probably thought the dog had heard an animal outside or was reacting to some normal house sound. They asked what was going on. I tried to explain that she was barking at the corner. I do not remember whether I told them that the corner had always scared me. Maybe I did. Maybe I was too embarrassed to say it out loud. But I know I pointed at the spot, and I know the dog kept staring at it. My parents looked. They saw nothing. They listened for a minute. Nothing eventually. They sent her into the backyard to use the bathroom and told me it was probably nothing. Maybe they thought she smelled a mouse in the wall. Maybe they thought she had heard something outside. Maybe they believed the light had startled her. That was probably the reasonable explanation. But I could not let it go. The dog had reacted too strongly. And she had reacted to the one place that had always made me feel watched. After that night, the corner bothered both of us. We lived in that house for another 5 or 6 years, and the feeling never completely left. I still avoided walking through the living room at night. I still turned lights on before I crossed it. I still moved faster than I needed to when I had to pass that part of the room. But now, I watched the dog too. Sometimes she would be perfectly calm in the living room, sleeping on the rug or lying near the couch. Then, suddenly, she would lift her head and stare toward that corner. At first, she would only look. Her head would tilt slightly, the way dogs do when they are trying to understand a sound or something they can see. Her ears would move forward. She would focus on that one dark spot with a puzzled expression, like she was trying to figure out what she was looking at. During the daytime, that was usually all she did. She would stare, tilt her head, maybe sniff the air, then eventually look away. No barking, no whining, no panic. It almost seemed like whatever was there during the day was quieter, less threatening, or harder for her to understand. But at night, it was different. There were several times when she reacted the same way she had that first night. We would be walking through the living room, or she would be resting near one of us, and suddenly she would lock her eyes onto the corner. Then she would bark. Not every time, not constantly, but enough times that I started dreading it. It was the same kind of bark, too. That sharp, frightened, angry sound that did not seem like her normal voice. She would bark at the corner, whine, and refuse to approach it. I would turn on the lights. Every single time, there would be nothing there. That was the worst part. If we had ever seen something, I think I would have been less confused. If there had been a mouse running along the wall, a cat outside casting a shadow, a loose curtain moving, or even some strange object in the room, at least we would have had an answer. But there was never anything. Just an empty corner. A bright room, a scared dog, and the feeling that something had been there a second before the lights came on. There were nights when I would stand in the hallway and watch her stare at it. I would try to see what she saw. I would look at the wall, the floor, the baseboard, the ceiling, the furniture around it. I would check for bugs. I would listen for scratching inside the walls. I would look for reflections from the windows. I would try to explain the behavior in a way that made sense. Maybe there were rodents in the wall. Maybe there was a vent nearby that made a sound only she could hear. Maybe there was a smell trapped in the carpet. Maybe the corner had shadows that confused her. All of those things are possible. Dogs notice sounds, smells, and movement humans miss all the time. A dog can stare at a wall because of insects, pipes, mice, electrical sounds, or a scent left behind by another animal. They can bark at nothing because we simply cannot detect what they are reacting to. I know that. But the timing made it hard to ignore. She did not react to every corner of the house. She did not bark at random walls. She did not avoid other rooms. It was always that one place in the living room. The same place that had bothered me long before we got her. And even though I knew there could be a normal explanation, I could never make myself feel comfortable around it. At night, the room felt different. The darkness seemed to collect there. I would turn on the light and see an ordinary corner, but before I did, I would sometimes feel that old familiar pressure in my chest. I would feel watched. I would feel like something was waiting for me to notice it. The dog made that feeling harder to dismiss. There is a certain kind of comfort in thinking your fear is just your imagination. You can tell yourself that you are being dramatic. You can tell yourself that childhood anxiety has created a pattern where there is none. You can tell yourself that a dark corner is only a dark corner. But when an animal reacts the same way you do, that comfort disappears a little. I never saw a figure there. I never heard a voice. I never felt touched. Nothing attacked me. Nothing came out of the corner. Nothing happened that I could point to and say, this proves there was something. It was always just a feeling. Then the dog would bark, and the feeling would become harder to ignore. After we moved out, I thought the fear would vanish. I thought I would look back on it and laugh. I thought I would remember it as a strange childhood habit. Nothing more. Maybe the corner had simply been placed in a way that made it darker. Maybe there had been a draft, a smell, or an animal in the walls. Maybe the dog and I had both reacted to ordinary things in our own ways. But even now, I remember it. I remember how nervous I felt walking through that room after dark. I remember rushing to turn on the lights. I remember the dog freezing at the entrance to the living room, staring into that corner, then barking as though something had finally moved. And I remember how empty it looked when the lights came on. That is what still bothers me, not what I saw. Because I saw nothing. It is what I felt, and what my dog seemed to feel, too.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.